Peasants, a short story about aging and old age by Anton Chekhov. 1. Nikolai Chikildeev, a waiter in the Moscow hotel Slaviansky Bazaar, was taken ill. His legs went numb and his gait was affected, so that on one occasion, as he was going along the corridor, he tumbled and fell down with a tray full of ham and peas. He had to leave his job. All his own savings and his wife's were spent on doctors and medicines. They had nothing left to live upon. He felt dull with no work to do, and he made up his mind he must go home to the village. It is better to be ill at home, and living there is cheaper, and it is a true saying that the walls of home are a help. He reached Zhukovo towards evening. In his memories of childhood, he had pictured his home as bright, snug, comfortable. Now, going into the hut, he was positively frightened. It was so dark, so crowded, so unclean. His wife, Olga, and his daughter, Sasha, who had come with him, kept looking in bewilderment at the big, untidy stove, which filled up almost half the hut and was black with soot and flies. What lots of flies! The stove was on one side, the beams lay slanting on the walls, and it looked as though the hut were just going to fall to pieces. In the corner, facing the door, under the holy images, bottle labels and newspaper cuttings were stuck on the walls instead of pictures. The poverty, the poverty. Of the grown-up people, there were none at home. All were at work at the harvest. On the stove was sitting a white-headed girl of 8, unwashed and apathetic. She did not even glance at them as they came in. On the floor, a white cat was rubbing itself against the oven fork. "Puss! Puss!" Sasha called to her. "Puss!" "She can't hear," said the little girl. "She has gone deaf." "How is that?" "Oh, she was beaten." Nikolai and Olga realized from the first glance what life was like here, but said nothing to one another. In silence, they put down their bundles and went out into the village street. Their hut was the third from the end and seemed the very poorest and oldest looking. The second was not much better, but the last one had an iron roof and curtains in the windows. That hut stood apart, not enclosed. It was a tavern. The huts were in a single row, and the whole of the little village, quiet and dreamy, with willows, elders, and mountain ash trees peeping out from the yards, had an attractive look. Beyond the peasants' homesteads, there was a slope down to the river, so steep and precipitous that huge stones jutted out bare here and there through the clay. Down the slope, among the stones and holes dug by the potters, ran winding paths. Bits of broken pottery, some brown, some red, lay piled up in heaps, and below there stretched a broad, level, bright green meadow, from which the hay had been already carried, and in which the peasants' cattle were wandering. The river, 3/4 of a mile from the village, ran twisting and turning with beautiful leafy banks. Beyond it was again a broad meadow, a herd of cattle, long strings of white geese. Then, just as on the near side, a steep ascent uphill, and on the top of the hill, a hamlet and a church with 5 domes, and at a little distance, the manor house. "It's lovely here in your parts," said Olga, crossing herself at the sight of the church. "What space, O Lord!" Just at that moment, the bell began ringing for service. It was Saturday evening. 2 little girls down below, who were dragging up a pail of water, looked round at the church to listen to the bell. "At this time, they are serving the dinners at the Slaviansky Bazaar," said Nikolai dreamily. Sitting on the edge of the slope, Nikolai and Olga watched the sun setting, watched the gold and crimson sky reflected in the river, in the church windows, and in the whole air, which was soft and still and unutterably pure as it never was in Moscow. And when the sun had set the flocks and herds past, bleating and lowing, geese flew across from the further side of the river, and all sank into silence. The soft light died away in the air, and the dusk of evening began quickly moving down upon them. Meanwhile, Nikolai's father and mother, 2 gaunt, bent, toothless old people, just of the same height, came back. The women, the sisters-in-law Maria and Fiokla, who had been working on the landowner's estate beyond the river, arrived home too. Maria, the wife of Nikolai's brother Kyriak, had 6 children, and Fiokla, the wife of Nikolai's brother Denis, who had gone for a soldier, had 2. And when Nikolai, going into the hut, saw all the family, all those bodies, big and little, moving about on the lockers, in the hanging cradles and in all the corners, and when he saw the greed with which the old father and the women ate the black bread, dipping it in water, he realized he had made a mistake in coming here, sick, penniless, and with a family too. A great mistake. "And where is Kyriak?" he asked, after they had exchanged greetings. "He is in service at the merchant's," answered his father, "a keeper in the woods. He is not a bad peasant, but too fond of his glass." "He is no great help," said the old woman tearfully. "Our men are a grievous lot. They bring nothing into the house, but take plenty out. Kyriak drinks, and so does the old man. It is no use hiding a sin. He knows his way to the tavern. The Heavenly Mother is wrath." In honor of the visitors, they brought out the samovar. The tea smelt of fish. The sugar was grey and looked as though it had been nibbled. Cockroaches ran to and fro over the bread and among the crockery. It was disgusting to drink, and the conversation was disgusting too, about nothing but poverty and illnesses. But before they had time to empty their first cups, there came a loud, prolonged, drunken shout from the yard. "Ma Arya!" "It looks as though Kyriak were coming," said the old man. "Speak of the devil." All were hushed, and again, soon afterwards, the same shout, coarse and drawn out, as though it came out of the earth. "Ma Arya!" Maria, the elder sister-in-law, turned pale and huddled against the stove, and it was strange to see the look of terror on the face of the strong, broad-shouldered, ugly woman. Her daughter, the child who had been sitting on the stove and looked so apathetic, suddenly broke into loud weeping. "What are you howling for, you plague?" Fiokla, a handsome woman, also strong and broad-shouldered, shouted to her, "He won't kill you, no fear." From his old father, Nikolai learned that Maria was afraid to live in the forest with Kyriak, and that when he was drunk, he always came for her, made a row, and beat her mercilessly. "Ma Arya!" The shout sounded close to the door. "Protect me, for Christ's sake, good people!" faltered Maria, breathing as though she had been plunged into very cold water. "Protect me, kind people!" All the children in the hut began crying, and looking at them, Sasha, too, began to cry. They heard a drunken cough, and a tall, black-bearded peasant wearing a winter cap came into the hut, and was the more terrible because his face could not be seen in the dim light of the little lamp. It was Kyriak. Going up to his wife, he swung his arm and punched her in the face with his fist. Stunned by the blow, she did not utter a sound, but sat down, and her nose instantly began bleeding. "What a disgrace! What a disgrace!" muttered the old man, clambering up onto the stove. "Before visitors, too. It's a sin." The old mother sat silent, bowed, lost in thought. Fiokla rocked the cradle. Evidently conscious of inspiring fear and pleased at doing so, Kyriak seized Maria by the arm, dragged her towards the door, and bellowed like an animal in order to seem still more terrible. But at that moment he suddenly caught sight of the visitors and stopped. "Oh, they have come," he said, letting his wife go. "My own brother and his family." Staggering and opening wide his red, drunken eyes, he said his prayer before the image and went on. "My brother and his family have come to the parental home, from Moscow, I suppose. The great capital Moscow, to be sure, the mother of cities. Excuse me." He sank down on the bench near the samovar and began drinking tea, sipping it loudly from the saucer in the midst of general silence. He drank off a dozen cups, then reclined on the bench and began snoring. They began going to bed. Nikolai, as an invalid, was put on the stove with his old father. Sasha lay down on the floor, while Olga went with the other women into the barn. Aye, dearie," she said, lying down on the hay beside Maria. "You won't mend your trouble with tears. Bear it in patience, that is all. It is written in the scriptures. If anyone smite thee on the right cheek, offer him the left one also. Aye, aye, dearie. Then, in a low, sing-song murmur, she told them about Moscow, about her own life, how she had been a servant in furnished lodgings. And in Moscow the houses are big, built of brick, she said, and there are ever so many churches, 40 times 40, dearie, and they are all gentry in the houses, so handsome and so proper. Maria told her that she had not only never been in Moscow, but had not even been in their own district town. She could not read or write, and knew no prayers, not even Our Father. Both she and Fiokla, the other sister-in-law, who was sitting a little way off listening, were extremely ignorant and could understand nothing. They both disliked their husbands. Maria was afraid of Kyriak, and whenever he stayed with her, she was shaking with fear, and always got a headache from the fumes of vodka and tobacco with which he reeked. And in answer to the question whether she did not miss her husband, Fiokla answered with vexation, "Miss him?" They talked a little and sank into silence. It was cool, and a cock crowed at the top of his voice near the barn, preventing them from sleeping. When the bluish morning light was already peeping through all the crevices, Fiokla got up stealthily and went out, and then they heard the sound of her bare feet running off somewhere. 2. Olga went to church and took Maria with her. As they went down the path towards the meadow, both were in good spirits. Olga liked the wide view, and Maria felt that in her sister-in-law she had someone near and akin to her. The sun was rising. Low down over the meadow floated a drowsy hawk. The river looked gloomy. There was a haze hovering over it here and there, but on the further bank a streak of light already stretched across the hill. The church was gleaming, and in the manor garden the rooks were cawing furiously. "The old man is all right," Maria told her, "but Granny is strict. She is continually nagging. Our own grain lasted till carnival. We buy flour now at the tavern. She is angry about it. She says we eat too much." "Aye, aye, dearie. Bear it in patience, that is all. It is written, 'Come unto me, all ye that labour and are heavy laden.'" Olga spoke sedately, rhythmically, and she walked like a pilgrim woman with a rapid, anxious step. Every day she read the gospel, read it aloud like a deacon. A great deal of it she did not understand, but the words of the gospel moved her to tears, and words like "for as much as" and "verily" she pronounced with a sweet flutter at her heart. She believed in God, in the Holy Mother, in the saints. She believed one must not offend anyone in the world, not simple folks, nor Germans, nor gypsies, nor Jews, and woe even to those who have no compassion on the beasts. She believed this was written in the Holy Scriptures, and so, when she pronounced phrases from Holy Writ, even though she did not understand them, her face grew softened, compassionate, and radiant. "What part do you come from?" Maria asked her. "I am from Vladimir, only I was taken to Moscow long ago, when I was 8 years old." They reached the river. On the further side, a woman was standing at the water's edge, undressing. "It's our Fiokla," said Maria, recognizing her. "She has been over the river to the manor yard, to the steward's. She is a shameless hussy and foul-mouthed, fearfully." Fiokla, young and vigorous as a girl, with her black eyebrows and her loose hair, jumped off the bank and began splashing the water with her feet, and waves ran in all directions from her. "Shameless! Dreadfully!" repeated Maria. The river was crossed by a rickety little bridge of logs, and exactly below it, in the clear, limpid water, was a shoal of broad-headed mullets. The dew was glistening on the green bushes that looked into the water. There was a feeling of warmth. It was comforting. What a lovely morning, and how lovely life would have been in this world, in all likelihood, if it were not for poverty, horrible, hopeless poverty, from which one can find no refuge. One had only to look round at the village to remember vividly all that had happened the day before, and the illusion of happiness which seemed to surround them vanished instantly. They reached the church. Maria stood at the entrance and did not dare to go farther. She did not dare to sit down either. Though they only began ringing for Mass between 8 and 9, she remained standing the whole time. While the Gospel was being read, the crowd suddenly parted to make way for the family from the great house. Two young girls in white frocks and wide-brimmed hats walked in, with them a chubby, rosy boy in a sailor suit. Their appearance touched Olga. She made up her mind from the first glance that they were refined, well-educated, handsome people. Maria looked at them from under her brows, sullenly, dejectedly, as though they were not human beings coming in, but monsters who might crush her if she did not make way for them. And every time the deacon boomed out something in his bass voice, she fancied she heard, "Maria!" and she shuddered. 3. The arrival of the visitors was already known in the village, and directly after Mass a number of people gathered together in the hut. The Leonichevs and Matvyechevs and the Ilyichovs came to inquire about their relations who were in service in Moscow. All the lads of Zhukovo who could read and write were packed off to Moscow and hired out as butlers or waiters, while from the village on the other side of the river the boys all became bakers. And that had been the custom from the days of serfdom long ago, when a certain Luka Ivanitch, a peasant from Zhukovo, now a legendary figure who had been a waiter in one of the Moscow clubs, would take none but his fellow villagers into his service, and found jobs for them in taverns and restaurants. And from that time the village of Zhukovo was always called among the inhabitants of the surrounding districts Slavey Town. Nikolai had been taken to Moscow when he was 11, and Ivan Makarich, one of the Matvyechevs, at that time a head waiter in the Hermitage Garden, had put him into a situation. And now, addressing the Matvyechevs, Nikolai said emphatically, "Ivan Makarich was my benefactor, and I am bound to pray for him day and night, as it is owing to him I have become a good man." "My good soul," a tall old woman, the sister of Ivan Makarich, said tearfully. "And not a word have we heard about him, poor dear. In the winter he was in service at Omon's, and this season there was a rumor he was somewhere out of town, in gardens. He has aged. In old days he would bring home as much as 10 rubles a day in the summertime, but now things are very quiet everywhere. The old man frets." The women looked at Nikolai's feet, shod in felt boots, and at his pale face, and said mournfully, "You are not one to get on, Nikolai Osipich. You are not one to get on. No, indeed." And they all made much of Sasha. She was 10 years old, but she was little and very thin, and might have been taken for no more than 7. Among the other little girls, with their sunburnt faces and roughly cropped hair, dressed in long, faded smocks, she, with her white little face, with her big dark eyes, with a red ribbon in her hair, looked funny, as though she were some little wild creature that had been caught and brought into the hut. "She can read too," Olga said in her praise, looking tenderly at her daughter. "Read a little, child," she said, taking the gospel from the corner. "You read, and the good Christian people will listen." The testament was an old and heavy one in leather binding, with dog's-eared edges, and it exhaled a smell as though monks had come into the hut. Sasha raised her eyebrows and began in a loud rhythmic chant. "And the angel of the Lord appeared unto Joseph, saying unto him, Rise up, and take the babe and his mother." "The babe and his mother," Olga repeated, and flushed all over with emotion. "And flee into Egypt, and tarry there until such time as—" At the word tarry, Olga could not refrain from tears. Looking at her, Maria began to whimper, and after her Ivan Makarich's sister. The old father cleared his throat and bustled about to find something to give his granddaughter, but finding nothing, gave it up with a wave of his hand. And when the reading was over, the neighbors dispersed to their homes, feeling touched and very much pleased with Olga and Sasha. As it was a holiday, the family spent the whole day at home. The old woman, whom her husband, her daughters-in-law, her grandchildren all alike called Granny, tried to do everything herself. She heated the stove and set the samovar with her own hands, even waited at the midday meal, and then complained that she was worn out with work. and all the time she was uneasy for fear someone should eat a piece too much, or that her husband and daughters-in-law would sit idle. At one time, she would hear the tavern-keeper's geese going at the back of the huts to her kitchen garden, and she would run out of the hut with a long stick and spend half an hour screaming shrilly by her cabbages, which were as gaunt and scraggy as herself. At another time, she fancied that a crow had designs on her chickens, and she rushed to attack it with loud words of abuse. She was cross and grumbling from morning till night, and often she raised such an outcry that passers-by stopped in the street. She was not affectionate towards the old man, reviling him as a lazy bones and a plague. He was not a responsible, reliable peasant, and perhaps if she had not been continually nagging at him, he would not have worked at all, but would have simply sat on the stove and talked. He talked to his son at great length about certain enemies of his, complained of the insults he said he had to put up with every day from the neighbours, and it was tedious to listen to him. "Yes," he would say, standing with his arms akimbo. "Yes, a week after the exaltation of the cross, I sold my hay willingly at 30 kopecks a pood. Well and good. So you see, I was taking the hay in the morning with a good will. I was interfering with no one. In an unlucky hour I see the village elder, Anton Chekhov, coming out of the tavern. 'Where are you taking it, you ruffian?' says he, and takes me by the ear." Kyriak had a fearful headache after his drinking bout, and was ashamed to face his brother. "What vodka does! Ah, my God!" he muttered, shaking his aching head. "For Christ's sake, forgive me, brother and sister. I'm not happy myself." As it was a holiday, they bought a herring at the tavern and made a soup of the herring's head. At midday, they all sat down to drink tea and went on drinking it for a long time, till they were all perspiring. They looked positively swollen from the tea drinking, and after it began sipping the broth from the herring's head, all helping themselves out of one bowl. But the herring itself Granny had hidden. In the evening, a potter began firing pots on the ravine. In the meadow below, the girls got up a choral dance and sang songs. They played the concertina, and on the other side of the river, a kiln for baking pots was lighted too, and the girls sang songs, and in the distance, the singing sounded soft and musical. The peasants were noisy in and about the tavern. They were singing with drunken voices, each on his own account, and swearing at one another, so that Olga could only shudder and say, "Oh, holy saints!" She was amazed that the abuse was incessant, and those who were loudest and most persistent in this foul language were the old men who were so near their end. And the girls and children heard the swearing and were not in the least disturbed by it, and it was evident that they were used to it from their cradles. It was past midnight. The kilns on both sides of the river were put out, but in the meadow below and in the tavern the merrymaking still went on. The old father and Kyriak, both drunk, walking arm in arm and jostling against each other's shoulders, went to the barn where Olga and Maria were lying. "Let her alone," the old man persuaded him. "Let her alone. She is a harmless woman. It's a sin." "Maria!" shouted Kyriak. "Let her be. It's a sin. She is not a bad woman." Both stopped by the barn and went on. "I low ove the flowers of the field," the old man began singing suddenly in a high, piercing tenor. "I low ove to gather them in the meadows." Then he spat, and with a filthy oath went into the hut. 4. Granny put Sasha by her kitchen garden and told her to keep watch that the geese did not go in. It was a hot August day. The tavern-keeper's geese could make their way into the kitchen garden by the backs of the huts, but now they were busily engaged picking up oats by the tavern, peacefully conversing together, and only the gander craned his head high as though trying to see whether the old woman were coming with her stick. The other geese might come up from below, but they were now grazing far away the other side of the river, stretched out in a long white garland about the meadow. Sasha stood about a little, grew weary, and seeing that the geese were not coming, went away to the ravine. There she saw Maria's eldest daughter Motka, who was standing motionless on a big stone, staring at the church. Maria had given birth to 13 children, but she only had 6 living, all girls, not one boy, and the eldest was 8. Motka, in a long smock, was standing barefooted in the full sunshine. The sun was blazing down right on her head, but she did not notice that, and seemed as though turned to stone. Sasha stood beside her and said, looking at the church, "God lives in the church. Men have lamps and candles, but God has little green and red and blue lamps like little eyes. At night, God walks about the church, and with him the Holy Mother of God and St. Nikolai, thud, thud, thud. And the watchman is terrified, terrified. Aye, dearie," she added, imitating her mother. "And when the end of the world comes, all the churches will be carried up to heaven." "With the RBLs?" Motka asked in her deep voice, drawling every syllable. "With their bells. And when the end of the world comes, the good will go to paradise, but the angry will burn in fire eternal and unquenchable, dearie. To my mother, as well as to Maria, God will say, 'You never offended anyone, and for that, go to the right to paradise.' But to Kyriak and Granny, he will say, 'You go to the left into the fire.' And anyone who has eaten meat in Lent will go into the fire too." She looked upwards at the sky, opening wide her eyes, and said, "Look at the sky without winking. You will see angels." Motka began looking at the sky too, and a minute passed in silence. "Do you see them?" asked Sasha. "I don't," said Motka in her deep voice. "But I do. Little angels are flying about the sky and flap with their little wings as though they were gnats." Motka thought for a little, with her eyes on the ground, and asked, "Will Granny burn?" "She will, dearie." From the stone, an even gentle slope ran down to the bottom, covered with soft green grass, which one longed to lie down on or to touch with one's hands. Sasha lay down and rolled to the bottom. Motka, with a grave, severe face, taking a deep breath, lay down too, and rolled to the bottom, and in doing so tore her smock from the hem to the shoulder. "What fun it is!" said Sasha, delighted. They walked up to the top to roll down again, but at that moment they heard a shrill, familiar voice. Oh, how awful it was! Granny, a toothless, bony, hunchbacked figure with short grey hair which was fluttering in the wind, was driving the geese out of the kitchen garden with a long stick, shouting, "They have trampled all the cabbages, the damn brutes! I'd cut your throats, thrice accursed plagues! Bad luck to you!" She saw the little girls, flung down the stick, and picked up a switch, and seizing Sasha by the neck with her fingers, thin and hard as the gnarled branches of a tree, began whipping her. Sasha cried with pain and terror, while the gander, waddling and stretching his neck, went up to the old woman and hissed at her, and when he went back to his flock, all the geese greeted him approvingly with "Ga, ga, ga." Then Granny proceeded to whip Motka, and in this Motka's smock was torn again. Feeling in despair and crying loudly, Sasha went to the hut to complain. Motka followed her. She too was crying on a deeper note, without wiping her tears, and her face was as wet as though it had been dipped in water. "Holy saints!" cried Olga, aghast, as the two came into the hut. "Queen of Heaven!" Sasha began telling her story, while at the same time Granny walked in with a storm of shrill cries and abuse. Then Fiokla flew into a rage, and there was an uproar in the hut. "Never mind, never mind." Olga, pale and upset, tried to comfort them, stroking Sasha's head. "She is your grandmother. It's a sin to be angry with her. Never mind, my child." Nikolai, who was worn out already by the everlasting hubbub, hunger, stifling fumes, filth, who hated and despised the poverty, who was ashamed for his wife and daughter to see his father and mother, swung his legs off the stove and said in an irritable, tearful voice, addressing his mother, "You must not beat her. You have no right to beat her." "You lie rotting on the stove, you wretched creature," Fiokla shouted at him spitefully. "The devil brought you all on us. eating us out of house and home. Sasha and Motka and all the little girls in the hut huddled on the stove in the corner behind Nikolay's back, and from that refuge listened in silent terror, and the beating of their little hearts could be distinctly heard. Whenever there is someone in a family who has long been ill and hopelessly ill, there come painful moments when all timidly, secretly, at the bottom of their hearts, long for his death. And only the children fear the death of someone near them and always feel horrified at the thought of it. And now the children, with bated breath, with a mournful look on their faces, gazed at Nikolai and thought that he was soon to die, and they wanted to cry and to say something friendly and compassionate to him. He pressed close to Olga as though seeking protection and said to her softly in a quavering voice, "Olya, darling, I can't stay here longer. It's more than I can bear. For God's sake, for Christ's sake, write to your sister, Klavdia Abramovna. Let her sell and pawn everything she has. Let her send us the money. We will go away from here." "Oh, Lord," he went on miserably, "to have one peep at Moscow. If I could see it in my dreams, the dear place." And when the evening came on, and it was dark in the hut, it was so dismal that it was hard to utter a word. Granny, very ill-tempered, soaked some crusts of rye bread in a cup, and was a long time, a whole hour, sucking at them. Maria, after milking the cow, brought in a pail of milk and set it on a bench. Then Granny poured it from the pail into a jug just as slowly and deliberately, evidently pleased that it was now the fast of the Assumption, so that no one would drink milk, and it would be left untouched, and she only poured out a very little in a saucer for Fyokla's baby. When Maria and she carried the jug down to the cellar, Motka suddenly stirred, clambered down from the stove, and going to the bench where stood the wooden cup full of crusts, sprinkled into it some milk from the saucer. Granny, coming back into the hut, sat down to her soaked crusts again, while Sasha and Motka, sitting on the stove, gazed at her, and they were glad that she had broken her fast and now would go to hell. They were comforted and lay down to sleep, and Sasha, as she dozed off to sleep, imagined the day of judgment. A huge fire was burning, somewhat like a potter's kiln, and the evil one, with horns like a cow's and black all over, was driving Granny into the fire with a long stick, just as Granny herself had been driving the geese. 5. On the day of the Feast of the Assumption, between 10 and 11 in the evening, the girls and lads who were merrymaking in the meadow suddenly raised a clamour and outcry, and ran in the direction of the village, and those who were above on the edge of the ravine could not for the first moment make out what was the matter. "Fire! Fire!" they heard desperate shouts from below. "The village is on fire!" Those who were sitting above looked round, and a terrible and extraordinary spectacle met their eyes. On the thatched roof of one of the end cottages stood a column of flame, 7 feet high, which curled round and scattered sparks in all directions as though it were a fountain. And all at once the whole roof burst into bright flame, and the crackling of the fire was audible. The light of the moon was dimmed, and the whole village was by now bathed in a red, quivering glow. Black shadows moved over the ground. There was a smell of burning, and those who ran up from below were all gasping and could not speak for trembling. They jostled against each other, fell down, and they could hardly see in the unaccustomed light, and did not recognize each other. It was terrible. What seemed particularly dreadful was that doves were flying over the fire in the smoke, and in the tavern, where they did not yet know of the fire, they were still singing and playing the concertina as though there were nothing the matter. "Uncle Semyon's on fire!" shouted a loud, coarse voice. Maria was fussing about round her hut, weeping and wringing her hands, while her teeth chattered, though the fire was a long way off at the other end of the village. Nikolai came out in high felt boots. The children ran out in their little smocks. Near the village constable's hut, an iron sheet was struck. Boom, 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 floated through the air, and this repeated, persistent sound sent a pang to the heart and turned one cold. The old women stood with the holy icons, sheep, Calves, cows were driven out of the backyards into the street. Boxes, sheepskins, tubs were carried out. A black stallion, who was kept apart from the drove of horses because he kicked and injured them, on being set free ran once or twice up and down the village, neighing and pawing the ground, then suddenly stopped short near a cart and began kicking it with his hind legs. They began ringing the bells in the church on the other side of the river. Near the burning hut, it was hot and so light that one could distinctly see every blade of grass. Semyon, a red-haired peasant with a long nose, wearing a reefer jacket and a cap pulled down right over his ears, sat on one of the boxes which they had succeeded in bringing out. His wife was lying on her face, moaning and unconscious. A little old man of 80 with a big beard, who looked like a gnome, not one of the villagers, though obviously connected in some way with the fire, walked about bareheaded, with a white bundle in his arms. The glare was reflected on his bald head. The village elder, Anton Chekhov, as swarthy and black-haired as a gypsy, went up to the hut with an axe and hacked out the windows one after another, no one knew why, then began chopping up the roof. "Women, water!" he shouted. "Bring the engine! Look sharp!" The peasants, who had been drinking in the tavern just before, dragged the engine up. They were all drunk. They kept stumbling and falling down, and all had a helpless expression and tears in their eyes. "Wenches, water!" shouted the elder, who was drunk too. "Look sharp, wenches!" The women and the girls ran downhill to where there was a spring and kept hauling pails and buckets of water up the hill and pouring it into the engine, ran down again. Olga and Maria and Sasha and Motka all brought water. The women and the boys pumped the water. The pipe hissed, and the elder, directing it now at the door, now at the windows, held back the stream with his finger, which made it hiss more sharply still. "Bravo, Antip!" voices shouted approvingly. "Do your best!" Antip went inside the hut into the fire and shouted from within. "Pump! Bestir yourselves, good Christian folk, in such a terrible mischance." The peasants stood round in a crowd, doing nothing but staring at the fire. No one knew what to do. No one had the sense to do anything, though there were stacks of wheat, hay, barns, and piles of faggots standing all round. Kyriak and old Osip, his father, both tipsy, were standing there too. And as though to justify his doing nothing, old Osip said, addressing the woman who lay on the ground, "What is there to trouble about, old girl? The hut is insured. Why are you taking on?" Semyon, addressing himself first to one person and then to another, kept describing how the fire had started. "That old man, the one with the bundle, a house serf of General Zhukov's. He was cook at our general's, God rest his soul. He came over this evening. 'Let me stay the night,' says he. Well, we had a glass, to be sure. The wife got the samovar. She was going to give the old fellow a cup of tea, and in an unlucky hour she set the samovar in the entrance. The sparks from the chimney must have blown straight up to the thatch. That's how it was. We were almost burnt ourselves, and the old fellow's cap has been burnt. What a shame!" And the sheet of iron was struck indefatigably, and the bells kept ringing in the church the other side of the river. In the glow of the fire, Olga, breathless, looking with horror at the red sheep and the pink doves flying in the smoke, kept running down the hill and up again. It seemed to her that the ringing went to her heart with a sharp stab, that the fire would never be over, that Sasha was lost. And when the ceiling of the hut fell in with a crash, the thought that now the whole village would be burnt made her weak and faint, and she could not go on fetching water, but sat down on the ravine, setting the pail down near her. Beside her and below her, the peasant women sat wailing as though at a funeral. Then the stewards and watchmen from the estate, the other side of the river, arrived in 2 carts, bringing with them a fire engine. A very young student in an unbuttoned white tunic rode up on horseback. There was the thud of axes. They put a ladder to the burning framework of the house, and 5 men ran up it at once. Foremost of them all was the student, who was red in the face and shouting in a harsh, hoarse voice, and in a tone as though putting out fires was a thing he was used to. They pulled the house to pieces, a beam at a time. They dragged away the corn, the hurdles, and the stacks that were near. "Don't let them break it up!" cried stern voices in the crowd. "Don't let them!" Kyriak made his way up to the hut with a resolute air, as though he meant to prevent the newcomers from breaking up the hut, but one of the workmen turned him back with a blow in his neck. There was the sound of laughter. The workman dealt him another blow. Kyriak fell down and crawled back into the crowd on his hands and knees. Two handsome girls in hats, probably the student sisters, came from the other side of the river. They stood a little way off, looking at the fire. The beams that had been dragged apart were no longer burning, but were smoking vigorously. The student, who was working the hose, turned the water, first on the beams, then on the peasants, then on the women who were bringing the water. "George!" the girls called to him reproachfully in anxiety. "George!" The fire was over, and only when they began to disperse, they noticed that the day was breaking, that everyone was pale and rather dark in the face, as it always seems in the early morning when the last stars are going out. As they separated, the peasants laughed and made jokes about General Zhukov's cook and his cap, which had been burnt. They already wanted to turn the fire into a joke, and even seemed sorry that it had so soon been put out. "How well you extinguished the fire, sir," said Olga to the student. "You ought to come to us in Moscow. There we have a fire every day." "Why, do you come from Moscow?" asked one of the young ladies. "Yes, miss. My husband was a waiter at the Slaviansky Bazaar, and this is my daughter," she said, indicating Sasha, who was cold and huddling up to her. "She is a Moscow girl, too." The two young ladies said something in French to the student, and he gave Sasha a 20-kopeck piece. Old Father Osip saw this, and there was a gleam of hope in his face. "We must thank God, Your Honor. There was no wind," he said, addressing the student, "or else we should have been all burnt up together. Your Honor, kind gentlefolks," he added in embarrassment in a lower tone. "The morning's chilly. Something to warm one. Half a bottle to Your Honor's health." Nothing was given him, and clearing his throat, he slouched home. Olga stood afterwards at the end of the street and watched the two carts crossing the river by the ford and the gentlefolks walking across the meadow. A carriage was waiting for them the other side of the river. Going into the hut, she described to her husband with enthusiasm. "Such good people, and so beautiful. The young ladies were like cherubim." "Plague take them," Fiokla, sleepy, said spitefully. 6. Maria thought herself unhappy and said that she would be very glad to die. Fiokla, on the other hand, found all this life to her taste, the poverty, the uncleanliness, and the incessant quarrelling. She ate what was given her without discrimination, slept anywhere, on whatever came to hand. She would empty the slops just at the porch, would splash them out from the doorway, and then walk barefoot through the puddle. And from the very first day, she took a dislike to Olga and Nikolai, just because they did not like this life. "We shall see what you'll find to eat here, you Moscow gentry," she said malignantly. "We shall see." One morning, it was at the beginning of September, Fiokla, vigorous, good-looking and rosy from the cold, brought up 2 pails of water. Maria and Olga were sitting meanwhile at the table drinking tea. "Tea and sugar," said Fiokla sarcastically. "The fine ladies," she added, setting down the pails. "You have taken to the fashion of tea every day. You better look out that you don't burst with your tea drinking," she went on, looking with hatred at Olga. "That's how you have come by your fat mug, having a good time in Moscow, you lump of flesh." She swung the yoke and hit Olga such a blow on the shoulder that the 2 sisters-in-law could only clasp their hands and say, "Oh, holy saints!" Then Fiokla went down to the river to wash the clothes, swearing all the time so loudly that she could be heard in the hut. The day passed and was followed by the long autumn evening. They wound silk in the hut. Everyone did it, except Fiokla. She had gone over the river. They got the silk from a factory close by, and the whole family working together earned next to nothing, 20 kopecks a week. "Things were better in the old days under the gentry," said the old father as he wound silk. "You worked and ate and slept, everything in its turn. At dinner you had cabbage soup and boiled grain, and at supper the same again. Cucumbers and cabbage in plenty. You could eat to your heart's content, as much as you wanted. And there was more strictness. Everyone minded what he was about." The hut was lighted by a single little lamp, which burned dimly and smoked. When someone screened the lamp and a big shadow fell across the window, the bright moonlight could be seen. Old Ossip, speaking slowly, told them how they used to live before the emancipation, how in those very parts where life was now so poor and so dreary, they used to hunt with harriers, greyhounds, retrievers, and when they went out as beaters, the peasants were given vodka, how whole wagon-loads of game used to be sent to Moscow for the young masters, how the bad were beaten with rods or sent away to the Tver estate, while the good were rewarded. And Granny told them something too. She remembered everything, positively everything. She described her mistress, a kind, God-fearing woman whose husband was a profligate and a rake, and all of whose daughters made unlucky marriages. One married a drunkard, another married a workman, the other eloped secretly. Granny herself, at that time a young girl, helped in the elopement, and they had all three, as well as their mother, died early from grief. And remembering all this, Granny positively began to shed tears. All at once, someone knocked at the door, and they all started. "Uncle Ossip, give me a night's lodging." The little bald old man, General Zhukov's cook, the one whose cap had been burnt, walked in. He sat down and listened. Then he, too, began telling stories of all sorts. Nikolai, sitting on the stove with his legs hanging down, listened and asked questions about the dishes that were prepared in the old days for the gentry. They talked of rissoles, cutlets, various soups and sauces, and the cook, who remembered everything very well, mentioned dishes that are no longer served. There was one, for instance, a dish made of bull's eyes, which was called waking up in the morning. "And used you to do cutlets, la Marshal?" asked Nikolai. "No." Nikolai shook his head reproachfully and said, "Tut, tut, you are not much of a cook." The little girl, sitting and lying on the stove, stared down without blinking. It seemed as though there were a great many of them, like cherubim in the clouds. They liked the stories. They were breathless. They shuddered and turned pale with alternate rapture and terror, and they listened breathlessly, afraid to stir, to Granny, whose stories were the most interesting of all. They lay down to sleep in silence, and the old people, troubled and excited by their reminiscences, thought how precious was youth, of which, whatever it might have been like, nothing was left in the memory but what was living, joyful, touching, and how terribly cold was death, which was not far off, better not think of it. The lamp died down, and the dusk, and the two little windows sharply defined by the moonlight, and the stillness and the creak of the cradle reminded them for some reason that life was over, that nothing one could do would bring it back. You doze off, you forget yourself, and suddenly someone touches your shoulder or breathes on your cheek, and sleep is gone. Your body feels cramped, and thoughts of death keep creeping into your mind. You turn on the other side. Death is forgotten, but old, dreary, sickening thoughts of poverty, of food, of how dear flour is getting, stray through the mind, and a little later again you remember that life is over and you cannot bring it back. "Oh, Lord," sighed the cook. Someone gave a soft, soft tap at the window. It must be Fiokla come back. Olga got up and, yawning and whispering a prayer, opened the door, then drew the bolt in the outer room, but no one came in. Only from the street came a cold draught and a sudden brightness from the moonlight. The street, still and deserted, and the moon itself floating across the sky, could be seen at the open door. "Who is there?" called Olga. "I," she heard the answer. "It is I." Near the door, crouching against the wall, stood Fiokla, absolutely naked. She was shivering with cold, her teeth were chattering, and in the bright moonlight she looked very pale, strange, and beautiful. The shadows on her and the bright moonlight on her skin stood out vividly, and her dark eyebrows and firm, youthful bosom were defined with peculiar distinctness. "The ruffians over there undressed me and turned me out like this," she said. "I've come home without my clothes, naked as my mother bore me. Bring me something to put on." "But go inside," Olga said softly, beginning to shiver too. "I don't want the old folks to see." Granny was, in fact, already stirring and muttering, and the old father asked, "Who is there?" Olga brought her own smock and skirt, dressed Fiokla, and then both went softly into the inner room, trying not to make a noise with the door. "Is that you, you sleek one?" Granny grumbled angrily, guessing who it was. "Fie upon you, Nightwalker. Bad luck to you." It's all right," whispered Olga, wrapping Fiokla up. "It's all right, dearie." All was stillness again. They always slept badly. Everyone was kept awake by something worrying and persistent. The old man by the pain in his back, Granny by anxiety and anger, Maria by terror, the children by itch and hunger. Now, too, their sleep was troubled. They kept turning over from one side to the other, talking in their sleep, getting up for a drink. Fiokla suddenly broke into a loud, coarse howl, but immediately checked herself and only uttered sobs from time to time, growing softer and on a lower note, until she relapsed into silence. From time to time, from the other side of the river, there floated the sound of the beating of the hours, but the time seemed somehow strange. 5 was struck, and then 3. "Oh, Lord," sighed the cook. Looking at the windows, it was difficult to tell whether it was still moonlight or whether the dawn had begun. Maria got up and went out, and she could be heard milking the cows and saying, "Steady." Granny went out too. It was still dark in the hut, but all the objects in it could be discerned. Nikolai, who had not slept all night, got down from the stove. He took his dress coat out of a green box, put it on, and going to the window, stroked the sleeves and took hold of the coat-tails, and smiled. Then he carefully took off the coat, put it away in his box, and lay down again. Maria came in again and began lighting the stove. She was evidently hardly awake and seemed dropping asleep as she walked. Probably she had had some dream, or the stories of the night before came into her mind as, stretching luxuriously before the stove, she said, "No, freedom is better." 7. The master arrived. That was what they called the police inspector. When he would come, and what he was coming for, had been known for the last week. There were only 40 households in Zhukovo, but more than 2,000 rubles of arrears of rates and taxes had accumulated. The police inspector stopped at the tavern. He drank there 2 glasses of tea and then went on foot to the village elder's hut, near which a crowd of those who were in debt stood waiting. The elder, Anton Chekhov, was, in spite of his youth, he was only a little over 30, strict and always on the side of the authorities, though he himself was poor and did not pay his taxes regularly. Evidently he enjoyed being elder and liked the sense of authority, which he could only display by strictness. In the village council, the peasants were afraid of him and obeyed him. It would sometimes happen that he would pounce on a drunken man in the street or near the tavern, tie his hands behind him, and put him in the lockup. On one occasion, he even put Granny in the lockup because she went to the village council instead of Osip and began swearing, and he kept her there for a whole day and night. He had never lived in a town or read a book, but somewhere or other had picked up various learned expressions and loved to make use of them in conversation, and he was respected for this, though he was not always understood. When Osip came into the village elder's hut with his tax book, the police inspector, a lean old man with a long grey beard in a grey tunic, was sitting at a table in the passage, writing something. It was clean in the hut. All the walls were dotted with pictures cut out of the illustrated papers, and in the most conspicuous place near the icon there was a portrait of the Battenburg, who was the Prince of Bulgaria. By the table stood Antip Siedelnikov with his arms folded. "There is 119 rubles standing against him," he said when it came to Osip's turn. "Before Easter he paid a ruble, and he has not paid a kopeck since." The police inspector raised his eyes to Osip and asked, "Why is this, brother?" "Show divine mercy, Your Honor," Osip began, growing agitated. "Allow me to say last year the gentleman at Luteritsky said to me, 'Osip,' he said, 'sell your hay, you sell it,' he said. Well, I had 100 poods for sale. The women mowed it on the water meadow. Well, we struck a bargain all right, willingly." He complained of the elder and kept turning round to the peasants as though inviting them to bear witness. His face flushed red and perspired, and his eyes grew sharp and angry. "I don't know why you are saying all this," said the police inspector. I am asking you why you don't pay your arrears. You don't pay, any of you, and am I to be responsible for you?" "I can't do it." "His words have no sequel, Your Honor," said the elder. "The Chikildeevs certainly are of a defective class, but if you will just ask the others, the root of it all is vodka, and they are a very bad lot, with no sort of understanding." The police inspector wrote something down and said to Osip quietly, in an even tone, as though he were asking him for water, "Be off." Soon he went away, and when he got into his cheap chaise and cleared his throat, it could be seen from the very expression of his long, thin back that he was no longer thinking of Osip or of the village elder, nor of the Zhukovo arrears, but was thinking of his own affairs. Before he had gone 3/4 of a mile, Antip was already carrying off the samovar from the Chikildeev's cottage, followed by Granny, screaming shrilly and straining her throat. "I won't let you have it! I won't let you have it, damn you!" He walked rapidly with long steps, and she pursued him panting, almost falling over, a bent, ferocious figure. Her kerchief slipped onto her shoulders. Her grey hair with greenish lights on it was blown about in the wind. She suddenly stopped short, and like a genuine rebel, fell to beating her breast with her fists and shouting louder than ever in a sing-song voice, as though she were sobbing, "Good Christians and believers in God! Neighbours, they have ill-treated me. Kind friends, they have oppressed me. Oh, oh, dear people, take my part." "Granny, Granny," said the village elder sternly, "have some sense in your head." It was hopelessly dreary in the Chikildeev's hut without the samovar. There was something humiliating in this loss, insulting, as though the honour of the hut had been outraged. Better if the elder had carried off the table, all the benches, all the pots. It would not have seemed so empty. Granny screamed, Maria cried, and the little girls, looking at her, cried too. The old father, feeling guilty, sat in the corner with bowed head and said nothing. And Nikolai, too, was silent. Granny loved him and was sorry for him, but now, forgetting her pity, she fell upon him with abuse, with reproaches, shaking her fist right in his face. She shouted that it was all his fault. Why had he sent them so little when he boasted in his letters that he was getting 50 rubles a month at the Slaviansky bazaar? Why had he come, and with his family too? If he died, where was the money to come from for his funeral? And it was pitiful to look at Nikolai, Olga, and Sasha. The old father cleared his throat, took his cap, and went off to the village elder. Antip was soldering something by the stove, puffing out his cheeks. There was a smell of burning. His children, emaciated and unwashed, no better than the Chikildeevs, were scrambling about the floor. His wife, an ugly, freckled woman with a prominent stomach, was winding silk. They were a poor, unlucky family, and Antip was the only one who looked vigorous and handsome. On a bench there were 5 samovars standing in a row. The old man said his prayer to Battenberg and said, "Antip, show the divine mercy. Give me back the samovar, for Christ's sake. Bring 3 rubles, then you shall have it." "I can't do it." Antip puffed out his cheeks, the fire roared and hissed, and the glow was reflected in the samovar. The old man crumpled up his cap and said after a moment's thought, "You give it me back." The swarthy elder looked quite black and was like a magician. He turned round to Osip and said sternly and rapidly, "It all depends on the rural captain. On the 26th instant, you can state the grounds for your dissatisfaction before the administrative session, verbally or in writing." Osip did not understand a word, but he was satisfied with that and went home. 10 days later, the police inspector came again, stayed an hour, and went away. During those days, the weather had changed to cold and windy. The river had been frozen for some time past, but still there was no snow, and people found it difficult to get about. On the eve of a holiday, some of the neighbors came into Osip's to sit and have a talk. They did not light the lamp, as it would have been a sin to work, but talked in the darkness. There were some items of news, all rather unpleasant. In 2 or 3 households, hens had been taken for the arrears and had been sent to the district police station, and there they had died because no one had fed them. They had taken sheep, and while they were being driven away tied to one another, shifted into another cart at each village. One of them had died. And now they were discussing the question, who was to blame? "The Zemstvo," said Osip. "Who else?" "Of course it is the Zemstvo." The Zemstvo was blamed for everything, for the arrears, and for the oppressions, and for the failure of the crops, though no one of them knew what was meant by the Zemstvo. And this dated from the time when well-to-do peasants who had factories, shops, and inns of their own were members of the Zemstvos, were dissatisfied with them, and took to swearing at the Zemstvos in their factories and inns. They talked of gods not sending the snow. They had to bring in wood for fuel, and there was no driving nor walking in the frozen ruts. In old days, 15 to 20 years ago, conversation was much more interesting in Jukovo. In those days, every old man looked as though he were treasuring some secret, as though he knew something and was expecting something. They used to talk about an edict in golden letters, about the division of lands, about new land, about treasures. They hinted at something. Now the people of Jukovo had no mystery at all. Their whole life was bare and open in the sight of all, and they could talk of nothing but poverty, food, there being no snow yet. There was a pause. Then they thought again of the hens, of the sheep, and began discussing whose fault it was. "The Zemstvo," said Osip wearily. "Who else?" 8. The parish church was nearly 5 miles away at Kosogorovo, and the peasants only attended it when they had to do so for baptisms, weddings, or funerals. They went to the services at the church across the river. On holidays in fine weather, the girls dressed up in their best and went in a crowd together to church, and it was a cheering sight to see them in their red, yellow, and green dresses cross the meadow. In bad weather, they all stayed at home. They went for the sacrament to the parish church. From each of those who did not manage in Lent to go to confession in readiness for the sacrament, the parish priest, going the round of the huts with the cross at Easter, took 15 kopecks. The old father did not believe in God, for he hardly ever thought about him. He recognized the supernatural, but considered it was entirely the women's concern. And when religion or miracles were discussed before him, or a question were put to him, he would say reluctantly, scratching himself, "Who can tell?" Granny believed, but her faith was somewhat hazy. Everything was mixed up in her memory, and she could scarcely begin to think of sins, of death, of the salvation of the soul, before poverty and her daily cares took possession of her mind, and she instantly forgot what she was thinking about. She did not remember the prayers, and usually in the evenings, before lying down to sleep, she would stand before the icons and whisper, "Holy Mother of Kazan, Holy Mother of Smolensk, Holy Mother of Troyerotchitsy." Maria and Fiokla crossed themselves, fasted, and took the sacrament every year, but understood nothing. The children were not taught their prayers, nothing was told them about God, and no moral principles were instilled into them. They were only forbidden to eat meat or milk in Lent. In the other families it was much the same. There were few who believed, few who understood. At the same time, everyone loved the Holy Scripture, loved it with a tender, reverent love. But they had no Bible, There was no one to read it and explain it, and because Olga sometimes read them the gospel, they respected her, and they all addressed her and Sasha as though they were superior to themselves. For church holidays and services, Olga often went to neighboring villages and to the district town, in which there were 2 monasteries and 27 churches. She was dreamy, and when she was on these pilgrimages, she quite forgot her family, and only when she got home again suddenly made the joyful discovery that she had a husband and daughter, and then would say, smiling and radiant, "God has sent me blessings." What went on in the village worried her and seemed to her revolting. On Elijah's day they drank, at the Assumption they drank, at the Ascension they drank. The Feast of the Intercession was the parish holiday for Jukovo, and the peasants used to drink then for 3 days. They squandered on drink 50 rubles of money belonging to the mir, and then collected more for vodka from all the households. On the first day of the feast, the Chikildeevs killed a sheep and ate of it in the morning, at dinner time, and in the evening. They ate it ravenously, and the children got up at night to eat more. Kyriak was fearfully drunk for 3 whole days. He drank up everything, even his boots and cap, and beat Maria so terribly that they had to pour water over her. And then they were all ashamed and sick. However, even in Jukovo, in this slavey town, there was once an outburst of genuine religious enthusiasm. It was in August, when throughout the district they carried from village to village the Holy Mother, the giver of life. It was still and overcast on the day when they expected her at Jukovo. The girls set off in the morning to meet the icon, in their bright holiday dresses, and brought her towards the evening, in procession with the cross and with singing, while the bells pealed in the church across the river. An immense crowd of villagers and strangers flooded the street. There was noise, dust, a great crush, and the old father and granny and Kyriak all stretched out their hands to the icon, looked eagerly at it, and said, weeping, "Defender! Mother! Defender!" All seemed suddenly to realize that there was not an empty void between earth and heaven, that the rich and the powerful had not taken possession of everything, that there was still a refuge from injury, from slavish bondage, from crushing, unendurable poverty, from the terrible vodka. "Defender! Mother!" sobbed Maria. "Mother!" But the Thanksgiving service ended, and the icon was carried away, and everything went on as before, and again there was a sound of coarse, drunken oaths from the tavern. Only the well-to-do peasants were afraid of death. The richer they were, the less they believed in God, and in the salvation of souls, and only through fear of the end of the world put up candles and had services said for them, to be on the safe side. The peasants who were rather poorer were not afraid of death. The old father and granny were told to their faces that they had lived too long, that it was time they were dead, and they did not mind. They did not hinder Fiokla from saying in Nikolai's presence that when Nikolai died, her husband Denny would get exemption to return home from the army. And Maria, far from fearing death, regretted that it was so slow in coming, and was glad when her children died. Death they did not fear, but of every disease they had an exaggerated terror. The merest trifle was enough, a stomach upset, a slight chill, and Granny would be wrapped up on the stove and would begin moaning loudly and incessantly. "I am dying!" The old father hurried off for the priest, and Granny received the sacrament and extreme unction. They often talked of colds, of worms, of tumours which move in the stomach and coil round to the heart. Above all, they were afraid of catching cold, and so put on thick clothes even in the summer and warmed themselves at the stove. Granny was fond of being doctored, and often went to the hospital, where she used to say she was not 70 but 58. She supposed that if the doctor knew her real age he would not treat her, but would say it was time she died instead of taking medicine. She usually went to the hospital early in the morning, taking with her 2 or 3 of the little girls, and came back in the evening, hungry and ill-tempered, with drops for herself and ointments for the little girls. Once she took Nikolai, who swallowed drops for a fortnight afterwards, and said he felt better. Granny knew all the doctors and their assistants and the wise men for 20 miles round, and not one of them she liked. At the intercession, when the priest made the round of the huts with the cross, the deacon told her that in the town near the prison lived an old man who had been a medical orderly in the army, and who made wonderful cures and advised her to try him. Granny took his advice. When the first snow fell, she drove to the town and fetched an old man with a big beard, a converted Jew in a long gown, whose face was covered with blue veins. There were outsiders at work in the hut at the time. An old tailor in terrible spectacles was cutting a waistcoat out of some rags, and two young men were making felt boots out of wool. Kyriak, who had been dismissed from his place for drunkenness and now lived at home, was sitting beside the tailor mending a bridle. And it was crowded, stifling, and noisome in the hut. The converted Jew examined Nikolai and said that it was necessary to try cupping. He put on the cups, and the old tailor, Kyriak, and the little girls stood round and looked on, and it seemed to them that they saw the disease being drawn out of Nikolai, and Nikolai too watched how the cups suckling at his breast gradually filled with dark blood, and felt as though there really were something coming out of him, and smiled with pleasure. "It's a good thing," said the tailor. "Please God, it will do you good." The Jew put on 12 cups, and then another 12, drank some tea, and went away. Nikolai began shivering. His face looked drawn, and as the women expressed it, shrank up like a fist. His fingers turned blue. He wrapped himself up in a quilt and in a sheepskin, but got colder and colder. Towards the evening he began to be in great distress, asked to be laid on the ground, asked the tailor not to smoke. Then he subsided under the sheepskin, and towards morning he died. 9. Oh, what a grim, what a long winter. Their own grain did not last beyond Christmas, and they had to buy flour. Kyriak, who lived at home now, was noisy in the evenings, inspiring terror in everyone, and in the mornings he suffered from headache and was ashamed, and he was a pitiful sight. In the stall the starved cows bellowed day and night, a heart-rending sound to Granny and Maria. And as ill luck would have it, there was a sharp frost all the winter. The snow drifted in high heaps, and the winter dragged on. At Annunciation there was a regular blizzard, and there was a fall of snow at Easter. But in spite of it all, the winter did end. At the beginning of April, there came warm days and frosty nights. Winter would not give way, but one warm day overpowered it at last, and the streams began to flow, and the birds began to sing. The whole meadow and the bushes near the river were drowned in the spring floods, and all the space between Jukovo and the further side was filled up with a vast sheet of water, from which wild ducks rose up in flocks here and there. The spring sunset, flaming among gorgeous clouds, gave every evening something new, extraordinary, incredible, just what one does not believe in afterwards, when one sees those very colours and those very clouds in a picture. The cranes flew swiftly, swiftly, with mournful cries, as though they were calling themselves. Standing on the edge of the ravine, Olga looked a long time at the flooded meadow, at the sunshine, at the bright church that looked as though it had grown younger, and her tears flowed and her breath came in gasps from her passionate longing to go away, to go far away to the end of the world. It was already settled that she should go back to Moscow to be a servant, and that Kyriak should set off with her to get a job as a porter or something. Oh, to get away quickly. As soon as it dried up and grew warm, they got ready to set off. Olga and Sasha, with wallets on their backs and shoes of plaited bark on their feet, came out before daybreak. Maria came out too to see them on their way. Kyriak was not well, and was kept at home for another week. For the last time Olga prayed at the church and thought of her husband, and though she did not shed tears, her face puckered up and looked ugly like an old woman's. During the winter she had grown thinner and plainer, and her hair had gone a little grey, and instead of the old look of sweetness and the pleasant smile on her face, she had the resigned, mournful expression left by the sorrows she had been through, and there was something blank and irresponsive in her eyes, as though she did not hear what was said. She was sorry to part from the village and the peasants. She remembered how they had carried out Nikolai, and how a requiem had been ordered for him at almost every hut, and all had shed tears in sympathy with her grief. In the course of the summer and the winter, there had been hours and days when it seemed as though these people lived worse than the beasts, and to live with them was terrible. They were coarse, dishonest, filthy, and drunken. They did not live in harmony, but quarrelled continually, because they distrusted and feared, and did not respect one another. Who keeps the tavern and makes the people drunken? A peasant, who wastes and spends on drink the funds of the commune, of the schools, of the church. A peasant, who stole from his neighbours, set fire to their property, gave false witness at the court for a bottle of vodka. At the meetings of the Zemstvo and other local bodies, who was the first to fall foul of the peasants? A peasant. Yes, to live with them was terrible, but yet they were human beings. They suffered and wept like human beings, and there was nothing in their lives for which one could not find excuse. Hard labour that made the whole body ache at night, the cruel winters, the scanty harvests, the overcrowding, and they had no help and none to whom they could look for help. Those of them who were a little stronger and better off could be no help, as they were themselves coarse, dishonest, drunken, and abused one another just as revoltingly. The paltriest little clerk or official treated the peasants as though they were tramps, and addressed even the village elders and churchwardens as inferiors, and considered they had a right to do so. And, indeed, can any sort of help or good example be given by mercenary, greedy, depraved, and idle persons who only visit the village in order to insult, to despoil, and to terrorize? Olga remembered the pitiful, humiliated look of the old people when in the winter Kyriak had been taken to be flogged. And now she felt sorry for all these people, painfully so, and as she walked on, she kept looking back at the huts. After walking 2 miles with them, Maria said goodbye. Then, kneeling and falling forward with her face on the earth, she began wailing. "Again I am left alone. Alas, for poor me, poor, unhappy." And she wailed like this for a long time, and for a long way Olga and Sasha could still see her on her knees, bowing down to someone at the side and clutching her head in her hands, while the rooks flew over her head. The sun rose high. It began to get hot. Jukovo was left far behind. Walking was pleasant. Olga and Sasha soon forgot both the village and Maria. They were gay, and everything entertained them. Now they came upon an ancient barrow, now upon a row of telegraph posts running one after another into the distance and disappearing into the horizon, and the wires hummed mysteriously. Then they saw a homestead, all wreathed in green foliage. There came a scent from it of dampness, of hemp, and it seemed for some reason that happy people lived there. Then they came upon a horse's skeleton, whitening in the solitude in the open fields, and the larks trilled unceasingly, the corncrakes called to one another, and the landrail cried as though someone were really scraping at an old iron rail. At midday, Olga and Sasha reached a big village. There, in the broad street, they met the little old man who was General Zhukov's cook. He was hot, and his red, perspiring, bald head shone in the sunshine. Olga and he did not recognize each other, then looked round at the same moment, recognized each other, and went their separate ways without saying a word. Stopping near the hut, which looked newest and most prosperous, Olga bowed down before the open windows and said in a loud, thin, chanting voice, "Good Christian folk, give alms for Christ's sake, that God's blessing may be upon you, and that your parents may be in the kingdom of heaven in peace eternal." "Good Christian folk," Sasha began chanting, "give, for Christ's sake, that God's blessing, the heavenly kingdom,